vote. And I know a lot of people who don't even want to vote Republican anymore because of this. And can you tell me, is there going to be any more talk about the extension of the unemployment benefits? Thank you very much.
Absolutely. There will be. In fact,
I try to come down to the floor every week or so to give voices to the victims of gun violence all across this country every day and every week. Dozens, hundreds, thousands of Americans are gunned down on our streets and in our homes, in part because the United States Congress does absolutely nothing, has done absolutely nothing over the course of the past several years, over the course of the past decade, to try to curb this scourge of destruction that plagues virtually every corner of our society. 86 people a day die at the hands of guns. 2,639 people approximately every month. We lose 31,000 people every year. There's not another first world country in the world that can come close to the level of gun violence that we have here in the United States. And on top of these numbers are the horrific trend lines on mass shootings. Over the course of January, we saw a school shooting essentially every 2 days that school was in session. Luckily is not the word to ascribe to this sentence, but luckily, in each one of those instances, the damage was relatively minor to the potential damage that will unfortunately one day come when a shooter walks into one of these schools and is able to perpetrate the kind of violence that Adam Lanza did in Newtown, Connecticut. And we are sending a message of complicity when the United States Senate and the House of Representatives stands absolutely silent in the face of this violence. I've come down to the floor almost every week, and I hope almost every time I arrive at the floor, I let my colleagues know that I don't expect that any law that we pass is going to reduce 31,000 or 2,600 or 86 to 0. I understand the reality is that there is no law that we can pass that will end all incidences of gun violence, that there is no panacea to this problem that Congress can offer. But we send a pretty clear message when we do nothing. When the Senate does not act, when the House does not act, we tell people in this country that we must be okay with the numbers that continue to accrue and move upward. I know that that isn't the case. I know that my Republican colleagues are just as sickened as I am at 86 people dying every day from guns. I know that supporters of the NRA, gun owners themselves, can't stand that this number is so high at 31,000 a year. But if the stats don't do it, then hopefully the voices of these victims will. And so I offer you 4 more recent victims, these all from the streets of our cities in Connecticut. Bernard Hall was killed just a few days ago in New Haven, Connecticut, January 31st. He was shot and killed on the corner of East Pearl Street and Pierpont Street in New Haven. Emergency personnel were dispatched shortly after 10 p.m. and they found Hall lying on the ground, unresponsive, with a gunshot wound to his head. He was pronounced dead at the scene. He's the 3rd homicide victim of the year. 3rd homicide victim of the year, 31 days into January. A couple days later, about 60 people gathered at the corner where Hall was shot. He had a lot of family. He had a lot of friends. And they mourned together. His family members and friends remember him as a very kind person. The family says, "We don't want retaliation, we want justice. I need people to stop being afraid," said his sister Renee Evans. "I need people to stop being afraid to say what they see. If you see it, say it. You don't need to give your name. Anyone who knows something should just call the police." He was a well-liked person all across the neighborhood. Bernard Hall shot dead, 33 years old. Darrell Patrick Law was killed 10 days earlier in New Haven. He had just started attending church regularly, the Faith Revival Temple Church in West Haven. He had gone to one of his first services on January 19th, and he didn't make it to the next service, not by choice, but because he was shot dead on Eastern Street on January 20th. This was the city's first homicide of 2014. Mourners packed that church that he was just a new parishioner of to mourn him. They said that he was a good man who liked to goof around, especially with his many family members. Darrell leaves behind a 1-year-old son. He was really active in sports. In high school, he was only 20 years old. In high school, he had participated in football and track. Justin Mariano was 29 years old when just before the new year he was killed in Bridgeport, Connecticut. He was shot on the evening of November 9th. Police responded to Bridgeport Hospital where Mariano later died from his injuries. He had just started working at a barber shop called Sharp Cuts, and he was remembered by both the people that worked with him as well as the folks who trained him at a local cosmetology school as talented, bright, and energetic. Jerome Copeland was 22 years old when he was killed on the streets of Hartford. He was the 16th homicide victim in Hartford when he was killed in the late summer of 2013. A woman who knew him said that he was a young father. He was struggling. He was trying to make ends meet. He leaves behind a son, a brother, 2 sisters, and a loving girlfriend who described him as an energetic man who loved music. When I was at Central High School in Bridgeport a few weeks ago, I was sitting down with a group of kids who wanted to see what they could do to end the violence on the streets of their city, to feel a little bit safer when they walked to school in the morning. And I asked them all, how many of you know someone, a close relative or friend who's been killed by guns? And they looked at me strangely, in part because every single one of them raised their hands. At Central High School, you just accept that at some point before you reach the age of 18, you're going to know somebody, a close friend or relative, who has been killed by guns in that city. At a similar meeting of high school students in Hartford, Connecticut, one young girl said that the signs of police sirens at night were her lullaby growing up. That she just knew there was a pretty good chance on any night that someone was going to be killed in her neighborhood, and she had come to accept the signs of crisis response as just the pitter-pat of raindrops outside. To these kids, they look at their lives in which they fear for their safety when they walk to school, in which they accept the inevitable fact that they will lose someone close to them over the course of their teenage years, and they don't understand the complacency of the United States Senate. A recent study of Cook County hospitals in and around Chicago showed that of all of the people that they treated for episodes of violence, nearly half of them displayed signs of PTSD. The fact is that in these neighborhoods, PTSD is a reality in the same way that it is for our troops who serve for us overseas, because they witness horrific acts of violence in neighborhoods that are supposed to be safe for our kids. We shouldn't have to compare the levels of PTSD in the neighborhoods that our kids transit in the same way that we look at PTSD on the field of battle. It's time that we did something. Whether it's an investment in new mental health resources or beefed up background checks to make sure criminals aren't buying guns, or recognition that there are some weapons that probably deserve to be in the hands of the military rather than in the hands of everyday citizens. It's time for us to have an answer. These 31,286 are too high. And if the stats don't do it, then hopefully over time the voices of victims will. I yield back.
Madam President.
Senator from North Dakota.
Most of the country watched with, I think, a great deal of interest right before the new year when we unfortunately had a train derailment in Castleton, North Dakota. What was unique about this train derailment was that the train that derailed subsequently derailed another train and resulted in a fairly large explosion, which set shockwaves, I think, again, through the rest of the country as we started to address the issue of how do we maintain safety on the rails. And so we've been having a lot of discussions about what's the appropriate level of regulation. We have been having a lot of discussions about tank cars. The U.S. Department of Transportation has been meeting with the railroad industry as well as the oil and gas industry, trying to assure that whatever decisions are made enhance the safety. But I want to talk about something that's not about government regulation, and it's not about kind of long-term strategies, except to the point that it is about the heroics and the importance of first responders. And so I rise today to honor the heroics of Jeff Anderson, an engineer in training for Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad, whose bravery following the recent train derailment near Castleton prevented the dangerous explosions from the crash from spreading even further. For many of us in the Senate, the Castleton derailment has trained our focus on our efforts to improve safety for the rail shipment of crude oil. From increased track inspections to updated tanker car standards to the consideration of new routing options for crude shipments, all angles for improving the safety of crude rail shipments are being considered. What we should not overlook in our efforts, however, is the importance of skillful and well-trained railmen on the lines. Railmen like Jeff Anderson are the backbone of that industry. And when one goes above and beyond the call of duty to prevent a disaster from spreading, they deserve to be recognized. On December 30th, a grain car carrying soybeans to the Pacific Northwest derailed near Castleton, North Dakota. An axle broke on the car near the middle of the train, forcing the car off the rails and onto the tracks of the adjacent line, carrying trains in the opposite direction. Conductor Bruce Anderson and road foreman of engineers Paul Douglas radioed the emergency to the oncoming train on the opposite track, but there was insufficient time to slow down that train headed their way. In the brief moments following the derailment, an eastbound train carrying crude oil collided with a soybean car lying over the tracks, and that eastbound train exploded. Following the crash, Jeff and the entire crew of the westbound grain train sprang into action. Immediately following the derailment, conductor Bruce Anderson went back and pulled approximately 50 cars away from the fire. Recognizing the fire would soon spread to the remaining cars, Jeff worked with Assistant Fire Chief Adrian Kiefer to hatch a plan to couple back onto the remaining oil cars and unhook the tanker cars and pull them to safety. Jeff, a former civilian firefighter for the Grand Forks Air Force Base, borrowed 2 radios and fire protection gear from the Castleton Fire Department. His engineer and trainer, Tom Crooks, jumped into the rear engine of the train to reverse the locomotive towards the fire and connected the train to the tanker cars in danger of exploding. Jeff, armed in fire protection gear, walked towards the fire to connect the train to the cars. He then walked even closer to the fire to pull the pin on the closest tanker car within a safe distance, getting 25 more cars away from the fire. Now remember, these are cars filled with crude oil. Once the pin is pulled, Jeff radios to Tom to pull the cars away. Because of Jeff's heroics, the danger from the derailment were minimized and the explosions were isolated to the tanker cars adjacent to the derailment. Had it not been for Jeff, this disaster would have been much worse. I'd like to take this time to thank not only Jeff Anderson, but all those involved in the response, including engineer Tom Cooks, conductor Bruce Anderson, road foreman of engineers Paul Douglas, Castleton Fire Chief Tim McLean, and Castleton Assistant Fire Chief Adrian Kiefer for their presence of mind and their decisive action following the crash to minimize the danger of this derailment. And I rise with some awareness of what firemen do. As Attorney General for the state of North Dakota, I had the pleasure of also being responsible for the Fire Marshal's office. As somebody in charge of the Fire Marshal's office, I spent a great deal of time traveling across North Dakota, visiting not only with full-time firemen, but the wonderful volunteer fire offices that we have all across North Dakota. I have a special spot in my heart for firemen. My dad was chief of the fire department in Manador, North Dakota for years and years, and took that effort quite seriously, took the training quite seriously. And as we move forward in this discussion of guaranteeing the safety of crude moving on the rails, I would ask this body to consider a third prong, not beyond simply looking at routing decisions and prevention of derailment, and then in the unfortunate incidents, containment of the consequences of derailment. I ask everyone to consider the importance of training, the importance of doing everything that we can to provide the equipment and to provide the training and the resources to our first responders. Anyone who doubts the commitment of those first responders to put their life in harm's way need only look to the 9/11 responders and realize, if you've worked with firemen, they all knew when they walked into that building that their chances of returning were virtually non-existent. But yet they walked into that building in an effort that we can only shake our head at the heroics of that effort. And you take a look at the heroics of Jeff Anderson and his colleagues in doing everything that they could to promote public safety and to guarantee public safety. Let's respond with appropriate public policy and appropriate training and appropriate resources for our first responders. Madam President, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
And in a quorum call here on the floor of the Senate, just waiting for a senator to come to the floor, working today on military pay, specifically pensions, and repealing the 1% point reduction in the cost of living adjustment for military retirees that were part of the budget deal passed by the House and Senate in December. We're expecting to see a test vote on that at 5:30 Eastern Time. Over in the House this week, changing the way the newly created Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is funded and run, and we could see a vote on increasing the debt ceiling sometime this week in the House. While they're in a quorum call here on the Senate floor, we're going to take a look at some of today's Washington Journal on the space station and some of NASA's programs.
In this week's Your Money segment, we will take a look at the International Space Station. Managed by NASA, the station has been in full operation for 14 years. Joining us from the Johnson Space Center in Houston to talk about it is Mike Sofrodini. He's the program manager for the station. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure, Juana.
So, Mike, starting off, the president recently announced that the station would be extended until 2024. Walk me through why that's necessary and important.
Well, Juana, the International Space Station, of course, as you mentioned, has been in orbit for some time. In fact, we just celebrated our 15-year anniversary last November from the first Element launch. I'd say in about 2009, we began in earnest to focus on utilization as construction was winding down. So today, we're doing a number of experiments on board. We're doing technology work. But importantly also is the commercialization of low Earth orbit. So as we start to look forward, we're looking for companies to make investments in space to study what they can on ISS to see what it would be profitable in low Earth orbit. So one of the big reasons to extend is to allow these companies to be able to look forward and say, okay, ISS is going to be in orbit for a number more years, at least 10 more years. So when they look at their profit margins and the investment they have to make to do any research on board ISS and then to get it to orbit and go through its paces, you have to have a longer span to look to look over than just through about 2020. In addition to that, it was important to make these decisions now as we get ready to procure our next logistics flights and as we prepare for commercial crew to come on board. The longer time that we have to purchase services, the better our cost per flight will be. And so it was an appropriate time now to go ahead and extend ISS. And of course, we're very happy to hear this extended at least to 2024.
Mike, for our viewers who might not be familiar with the concept, explain what you mean when you say low Earth orbit.
So today, the International Space Station operates at about 410 kilometers. Of course, that varies day to day as we drift down and then reboost the vehicle, which is about 220 nautical miles above the Earth. And so low Earth orbit is in this regime. At some point, you transition to what we call geostationary orbit, which is about 22,000 kilometers up. So low Earth orbit is defined as the altitude close to the regime we're in within a few hundred miles.
Let's talk a little bit about cost. How much does it cost to operate the International Space Station every year?
Today we're at about $3 billion a year. It's important to remember to operate the station itself costs us a little over about $1 billion a year. However, the transportation services, both the vehicles that supplies logistics to ISS, water, food, the science experiments, spare parts, these vehicles plus the vehicles to carry the crews to orbit is the remainder of that cost per year.
We're talking this hour about the International Space Station. We'd love it if you joined our conversation this morning. For Republicans, the number is 202-585-3881. For Democrats, 202-585-3880. And for Independents, 202-585-3882. Mike, I want to take a question from Twitter now. @BoringFileClerk tweets, how much of ISS is funded by the U.S. and how much by other countries?
Well, it's hard to say exactly how much other countries contributed to the ISS. The estimates for the construction of ISS and operation to date is on the order of about $70 billion, and that's from the beginning when President Reagan asked us to consider building a space station back in 1985 timeframe. And so that's the estimate for the U.S. cost. Our partners' contributions are, other than our Russian colleagues, is less than that. They've provided modules and logistic services, but the backbone of the station really is the portions that the United States built. And in addition to that, an early portion of the station began with Russian modules flying to ISS, and so our Russian colleagues built the first two elements that established the ISS, or I should say one of the first three elements that establishes the ISS, and were really the cornerstone to the station for several years until the U.S. segment was built up. So to say exactly how much the partners have contributed, it's a difficult number to put down, but it's clear that the U.S. has probably spent more than any of the other partners that are contributing to the station to date.
Our first call for this segment comes from Byron in Ketchikan, Alaska, on our line for Independence.
Good morning. My congratulations to the people that are doing an excellent job up there.
Senator from Alaska.
Are we in a quorum call?
Yes,
I ask that the quorum call be vacated until time I complete my comments.
without objection.
Madam President, I rise today because I'm one of the sponsors of the bill pending before the Senate at this moment. As you know, the bill is about as simple as you can get around this place, a one-sentence measure to restore the fairness to America's military retirees. The bill will repeal the COLA cut Congress gave to working-age military retirees when we passed the budget just before Christmas. That budget bill had a lot of good provisions, and it passed with a large bipartisan support on both sides of the Capitol. It avoided another government shutdown, and Alaska's delegation was unified in passing that budget bill. It prevented another round of major cuts to the Defense Department and other agencies. It showed the American people that Republicans and Democrats can really work together. But it wasn't much of a Christmas present for our veterans, the brave Americans who made a career out of serving their country and, in many cases, putting their lives on the line. That budget deal says working-age military retirees will see their pension, COLA adjustments, reduced by 1% annually. For many of them, that's a hit totaling tens of thousands of dollars over years. For some, the total reduction of their lifetime is upwards to $80,000. It's completely unacceptable. That's why many of us only supported the budget deal, because we had already committed to rolling back the COLA cut once the deal was completed. Madam President, the bill before us right now will take care of the problem once and for all. The chief sponsors are Senator Hagan and Senator Pryor and Senator Shaheen and myself. Many others are coming on board. In fact, I don't know of a single member of this chamber who opposes making sure our military retirees continue to receive their full COLA. It's the right thing to do. With these heroes signed up to serve and made their military service a career, it's what they were promised. They should expect no less now. But I've been around the block a few times, and I know what's coming. Many of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle are going to come to this floor and talk a good game. They're going to pledge their loyalty to the troops. They're going to wrap themselves in the flag, and then they're going to pivot. They're going to start qualifying things. They're going to say the sky is falling, and they're going to say we can only pass this bill if we pay for it. We've already been down that road. Many of us in this chamber tried to fix the military COLA last month, but our efforts failed in a fight over what's known around here as the pay-for. And honestly, I'm sick of it. The bill before us right now, the bill I proudly sponsor, has no pay-for. Why? Why is that, people ask? It's because the men and women of our armed services have already paid up on their end of the deal, and now it's time for us to pay our part. Unfortunately, too many of them have paid the ultimate sacrifice with their lives. All of them, even those who served, who survived, and were lucky enough to retire, had agreed to put their lives on the line. That's the deal when you signed up to serve this country. So to my colleagues, I say, don't come down to this floor. Don't lecture me about paying for this bill, because it's a simple thing to do. I've got a list right here of Alaskan soldiers who died in the battle during the wars of Iraq and Afghanistan, the wars that weren't paid for. There are 22 names here in Alaska, a small populated state, so every one of those losses that are on this list hit us hard. In all, nearly 6,800 American soldiers have died in these two wars. Half of all these fallen soldiers were between the ages of 18 and 24 years old. Madam President, with permission, I'm going to read just a few of these names of our fallen Alaskans. Tech Sergeant Leslie Williams, Air Force, age 36, Juneau. PFC Adar Cleveland, Army, age 19, Anchorage. Sergeant Curtis Arkella, Army, age 22, Palmer. Mike Olasky, Marine Reserves, age 22, Sterling. 22 Alaskans have paid the price. Now, granted, we'll never know if these brave soldiers would have chosen to make full career out of the military. We'll never know if they would have collected a pension from the country they served. But this much we do know. Every American troop who is serving right now, especially the career soldiers, signed up with a promise from the rest of us that in return for their sacrifice, their government would take care of them. It's time for those of us in Congress to step up and do that, both sides of this aisle on both sides of the Capitol. It's time for us to pass this bill and to make good once again on the end of the deal. Let me make one point. Our actions so far on this issue are not theatrical. This isn't about ideological policy debate. By voting to reduce the COLA adjustments, we have already impacted real people, real families, and created uncertainty in their future. Here are just the two examples of Alaska constituents. A soldier from Anchorage wrote to me and said this: I myself am in active duty, just over 18 years of service. Maybe I made a mistake by devoting my life from the age of 19 to now to the Air Force. He said he has moved 6 times, has 2 failed marriages, 2 children, 1 who is disabled. He says we change the rules of the game now, and he wonders what would happen if he had chosen a college instead of the military. His letter says, I can't undo 18 years of service. I can't change my career path. It seems very unfair to me to be changing our retirement like this. Another family wrote to me from North Pole, up near Fairbanks. The husband served 20 years in the Air Force, and their daughter is currently a major in the Air Force. They were promised benefits for life, like good health care and retirement benefits with a COLA adjustment. The husband could have left sooner and started another career, but he chose to stay because of the benefits. Their message to me is very simple. To vote to reduce the COLA breaks faith with them, with those already retired and with everyone who has chosen a military career. And what about those bright young people who are deciding right now whether to join up and sign up, perhaps make a career out of the military? What are they thinking about their Congress and their future? We need to fix this and fix it right now, starting with our vote this evening. Not next month, not later this spring, not next fall, but right now. Madam President, I know there's going to be a lot of debate. Hopefully tonight we'll see the cloture vote and we'll move to the debate. I know there'll be a list of pay-fors. As I said earlier, the people who this protects and ensures that they have a COLA and a retirement that they can depend on are people who serve this country. They put their lives on the line. We have an obligation today, tonight, and tomorrow to finish this up and put their COLA back in place. And I know we'll hear the arguments, about the deficit and all these explanations, but I can't say enough about the payment that's already been made by our military, by the people who serve not only on the front lines, but serve throughout our military, throughout this world, in serving and protecting our country. Madam President, I hope that we put aside our political debates, our politicking, and get on with doing what's right. And when you put this in perspective, about the 6,800 people who perished in the two wars. The two unpaid for wars, let me remind folks, $2 trillion plus unpaid for. This is a $6 billion issue over the next 10 years. It's a small amount to make sure we solve this problem for our retirees. I would hope that my colleagues, and I can tell you there is broad support. When you look at the Military Coalition, an incredible organization of many of our military organizations around the country who've sent a letter today supporting SB 1963. This is the bill that we have up tonight. So I would hope, again, members of both sides, especially the members on the other side, put aside this whole argument on the pay for and let's get on with doing what's right for our retirees. They have paid the price, they have served this country, and it is our time to pay the price and pay the bill, and that is voting for this piece of legislation tonight and voting to close it in cloture and then moving on to final passage. Madam President, I appreciate the time. I look forward to the debate. I yield the floor in notice of absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Back in a quorum call here on the Senate floor, waiting for senators to come to the floor to speak. And today, again, working on military pay, specifically pensions, and repealing the cut in the cost of living adjustment for military retirees, part of the budget deal passed by the House and Senate in December. We're expecting they'll take a test vote in about 15 minutes, 5:30 Eastern Time. And over in the House, a bill that would change the way the newly created Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is funded and run. We should see that this week, as well as work on increasing the debt ceiling. The Associated Press reports House Republicans might tie the reversal of the military pensions cut that's being worked on here in the Senate to increasing the debt limit. Again, you read more at the Associated Press.
Without objection.
Madam President, I see on the calendar S-1963, a bill to repeal certain reductions made by the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2013. I didn't vote for the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2013, and my no vote was cast for one reason. It is this so-called CPI -1 injustice that was done to military retirees. Those military retirees under the age of 62, under this newly passed bipartisan budget bill that has been signed by the President, will not be able to keep up with the cost of living because their annual cost of living adjustment, or COLA, would be reduced each year by 1%. I think we have clearly pointed out to the American people the injustice of this provision in the Budget Act. Over time, an enlisted person would lose some $80,000 lifetime out of his or her pocket. These are military members who fulfilled every part of their bargain. And the government comes along and tells them, after they've done their share, after they've subjected themselves to worldwide duty, after they've been in a war zone perhaps any number of times, the government comes along in the form of this bill and says, we've changed our minds. We're not going to give you your full cost of living. We're going to take 1% from that each year. For officers, it's even more than the $80,000 lifetime. And I think most Americans now realize that it was a mistake to do this, that it needs to be corrected, and we need to go back to keeping our promise to military retirees. We have an obligation to military retirees to do this. At the same time, Madam President, we have an obligation to future generations not to go back on the budget savings that were so hard fought in this Budget Act. I supported the level of budget savings. I just didn't like the way they were done. And time again, Senator Ayotte, Senator Graham, and I and others came to the Senate floor pointing out that there are other ways to pay for the savings that need to be made in the budget. There are better ways than taking it out of the hides of the people who volunteered to serve their country in the military. So we have a bill that we will be considering, S. 1963, and it's authored by Mr. Pryor, Mrs. Hagan, Mrs. Shaheen, and Mr. Begich. I like the idea of addressing the problem. There's only one fault in the bill, and that it does not have a pay for. So of the budget savings that were made last December, some $6 billion of that would simply go away. We would be spending that $6 billion that we were wanting to save. Our obligation needs to be to the military people and also to future generations. Why do we need to cut $6 billion? Why do we need to stay with these $6 billion in budget savings? Because we have an obligation to do something about the debt. That's the whole reason for the budget bill last December, is we are drowning in a sea of debt to the tune of $17 trillion plus and growing every day. And so we need to rectify the wrong done to military people. At the same time, we need to find the budget savings elsewhere. Today, I will vote to proceed to the bill. I will do so in the hope that Republicans and conservatives will be allowed to offer amendments in the regular order to pay for this bill, to find the $6 billion in savings needed over a 10-year period to pay for this bill. Now, there is legislation, there's a proposal by Senator Ayotte, Senator Graham, and I, that would use an Obama administration to pay for the cost of rectifying the wrong to the military retirees. It is a closing of a loophole in the United States tax code, a loophole that allows people improperly to claim an additional child credit. The Joint Committee on Taxation has estimated that this change could save approximately $20 billion over the next decade. This was an issue identified by the Obama administration's Treasury Department and by the Inspector General there. So we're not taking we're not taking something from the Heritage Foundation. This is something from the Treasury Department of the Obama administration and from their Inspector General. And I would simply submit to my colleagues, let's rectify the wrong done to the military retirees. But let's admit also we have an obligation to future generations to not add to the debt any more than this Congress has already done. We can fulfill both of these obligations today. But the way to do it is to vote for cloture on the motion to proceed, which I will do, and I think many of my Republican colleagues will do so. We ask in return for regular order on this important bill. Allow amendments. Allow pay-fors. Perhaps the Ayotte, Graham, Wicker pay-for, perhaps others. If there are members on the other side of the aisle, among my Democrat friends, about a better pay-for, bring that to the floor, offer it, let the sunshine shine on these suggestions, and let the American people know where we stand on righting the wrong and also protecting future taxpayers. So vote, I would say to my colleagues, vote yes on cloture on the motion to proceed. But I would say to the leadership, don't lock it down this time like you usually do. Don't fill up the amendment tree. Allow Republicans, allow Democrats who have other ideas about how to protect our future generations from a sea of debt to bring those ideas to the floor, vote on them, and let the American people see that we can correct this wrong to the military without adding $6 billion to the debt. So thank you Madam President, I hope that we can have a bipartisan consensus and begin this new year with regular order and with allowing the elected representatives of the states to work their will rather than having deals cut behind closed doors. Thank you, Madam President.
I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Back in a quorum call on the Senate floor, and working today on military pay, pensions, and repealing the cut in the cost of living adjustments for military retirees. Expecting a test vote on that in about 6 minutes, 5:30 Eastern Time. Over in the House, working this week on a bill that would change the way the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is run and funded. We could see work on an increase in the debt ceiling over in the House as well.
Madam President,
Senator from Florida.
I ask consent that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 298, S. 1963, a bill to repeal Section 403 of the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2013, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to proceed to S. 1963, a bill to repeal Section 403 of the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2013, shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, thank you. Mr. Baggage. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Coates, Cornyn, Flake, Harkin, Hirono, Johans, Inhofe, Landrieu, Merkley, Nelson, Schatz, Shelby, Udall of New Mexico, Vitter, and Wicker. No senator voted in the negative. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. McCain, aye. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr. Aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Isaacson, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, aye. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. King. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Donnelly, aye. Mr. Franken. Mr. Franken, aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, aye. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller, aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, aye. Ms. Heitkamp, aye. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. And Alexander? Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, aye. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions, aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Alexander. Mr. Alexander, aye. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. Kirk. Mr. Kirk, aye. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, aye.